Welcome back to Business Ethics. I'm Tom, and today we are talking about the topic of what is ethics, right? So I break down two different modules. Module one has to do with what is ethics, and then module two is what is business ethics, right? So we're going to bracket the business piece mostly. So the question is, what is ethics, right? That is a very loaded question, and it's a question that ethical theorists have been trying to answer for a long, long time and have given different answers. There are answers to that. It's just a question if it's the right answer, right? When we're talking about, ethics in general, ethics has to do with the distinction between right and wrong and good and bad, right? We have a very intuitive sense of this, right? Everything we do pretty much has some sense of correctness to it, right? There's a right way to act in particular situations. There's a right way to behave at work or at school with your family, all that kind of stuff, right? And we use that kind of sense of correctness, sense of ethical sensibility, right, all the time. So we're very good at employing ethical judgment, right? But when we're talking about ethics, usually we're not just talking about employing some kind of ethical standard, right? And that means we're not just judging particular actions, right? We are talking about what kind of grounds that distinction between right and wrong, right? What is the basis upon which we can decide that some action is right and some other action is wrong, right? And that's what ethical theory does, and that's what we'll be covering it for a good portion of this class, right? Ethical theory has to do with theories that are trying to determine that distinction between right and wrong, right? And they're gonna mostly agree on lots of different things, but they will come apart at certain places, right? We will cover three main ethical theories. The first one is consequentialism. And consequentialism is very simply the idea that what determines what is right or wrong is the consequences that the action produces. Particularly if your action produces more happiness, then it produces the opposite, pain, suffering, sadness, then it's right, right? If your action um, produces bad consequences, then it is bad, right? Um, Second, the second theory that we will talk about is deontology. And deontology is the study of duty, and is the idea that what is right or wrong is based on the principles upon which we act, right? So this is about someone doing the right thing because it is right, and that's it, and not caring about the consequences, right? Sometimes we do something that is the right thing, even though it doesn't really feel good, or maybe it doesn't really obviously benefit anyone. There's just certain principles you need to stick to, right? Like honesty or something like this, right? And then the third main theory that we will talk about is virtue ethics. And virtue ethics bases ethics on this sense of what it is to be a good person, right? And that's very holistic, looking at the individual as a collection of all kinds of actions, attitudes, emotions, intentions. And it's about kind of finding a balance, right, between all those kinds of things. And it's not so much focused on what it is to do the right thing in this particular situation. It's more about living a good life, right? So these are very different ethical paradigms. We will talk about those. There are two other kind of theories that we will talk about. One is ethical egoism, which is the idea that what is right or wrong has to do with what serves your self-interest, right? And we'll also talk about moral relativism a little bit later in the semester, and that is the idea that usually we'll talk about cultural relativism, and that's the idea that really what's right or wrong, our kind of ethical sensibility can be cashed out in terms of cultural norms, right? And that there are just different cultures with different senses of right and wrong, and everyone adopts their own culture's kind of sensibility there, ethical sensibility. Um, now, now notice that we were talking about like kind of what justifies that distinction between right and wrong. This is different than, as I mentioned, employing some kind of ethical standard, right? And so in a business ethics class, I think sometimes students think I'm going to tell them what the right thing to do is in a business situation. That's not what we're doing here. We're really kind of focusing on the tools to be able to analyze an ethical dilemma and look at it from different perspectives and kind of understand what the real kind of ethical tension is there, and look at some ways that different companies or individuals have dealt with these, and kind of give us the tools to come to our own conclusions about those ethical dilemmas, right, and ethical situations. Now, the main thing to focus on when it comes to ethics and why it's important and why it's not so straightforward and it's difficult to study is that ethics deals with ought statements. It deals with how we ought to act, right? In the reading, this will talk about the is ought distinction, right? Is statements are, this coffee is on the table, right? That's a factual statement. You determine whether or not it's true or false by looking to see if the coffee is on the table, right? Odd statements are different, right? So the example I like to give for this is, here's an is statement. My car is red, right? If we want to know if that's true, we go out in the parking lot and we look at it, right? And if the car is red, that's true. If the car is any other color besides red, then it's false. Very, very simple, right? That's a factual statement. Now, if I said my car ought to be red, that's more difficult to try to evaluate, right? If we go out to the parking lot and my car is red, it seems like it doesn't falsify that statement. It also doesn't make it true, right? It just means that my car is the color it ought to be. Now, if my car is gray, that means that, and the statement is my car ought to be red. That means, I don't know, maybe I need to get a new car, or maybe I need to get a paint job or something like this, right? It's a call to action in some way. But neither of, the color of my car does not kind of determine that statement to be true or false when it has the ought in it, right? That my car ought to be red is saying an ideal about the color of my car, which is kind of a stupid example, but it brings home the point, right? Now that's very analogous to something like one ought not steal, right? If lots of people steal, it doesn't make it false, right? If no one ever stole, it doesn't make it true, right? It doesn't really have a bearing on whether or not it's true or false, but we want to say that one ought not to steal is true, whereas one ought to steal is false in some sense, right? That one of them is the right ethical principle, right? One of them tells us what we really ought to do. And so that's a weird kind of those odd statements, since we're dealing with ideals, we're dealing with norms, we're dealing with rules, right? It's very difficult to evaluate them as being correct or incorrect, right? The norms themselves, the rules. And this brings up the issue, how do we know that our ethical standards are the right ethical standards, right? So that's what we will be focusing on in this course, right? One thing that I do want to mention about the reading is that it does have some kind of handy little kind of non-starters. Ethics in the law are different, right? There are laws that are unethical, and there are laws that are ethical that we think express our ethical sensibility. So we can't really appeal to the law. Another thing they talk about is popularity or a popular opinion or practice, right? Just because a lot of people do something, it doesn't make it right. And just because a lot of people don't do something, it doesn't make it wrong. The example I give in my notes is that if a lot of people steal or if the murder rate goes up, it doesn't diminish the moral value of those principles, right? That we ought not to steal or we ought not to murder, right? It doesn't really have an impact. So we can't really appeal to just the way people behave. We can't appeal to the law, these kinds of things. We really need some other kind of grounding for to try to justify the ethical principles that we want to lean on, right? So yeah, that's it for right now, and we will talk more about how ethics and the version of applied ethics in terms of business ethics.